The dust of the high plains was a language Tobias McCoy understood. It spoke in plumes behind the hooves of his cattle, in fine veils that settled on the weathered sill of his cabin, and in the gritty film that coated his tongue on a dry day. For 30 years, this ranch had been his sanctuary and his sentence, a sprawling expanse of grama grass and unforgiving sky that had absorbed the echoes of a war he'd left behind, and the silence of a life lived mostly alone. His world was a map of reliable constants, the groan of the windmill in a rising wind, the lowing of the herd at dusk, and the steady, living presence of the horse he called Thunder. The stallion was more than livestock. He was the other half of a silent conversation that had lasted a decade. A powerful creature of deep bay muscle and quiet intelligence, Thunder was the anchor of Tobias's routine, the keeper of his solitary peace. He'd found the horse 10 years back, a stray with a nasty scar on his left hind leg and ribs stark as a washboard, caught in a section of downed fence line after a storm. There was a wildness in his eye then, a terror that Tobias recognized. He hadn't tried to break the horse, not in the traditional sense. He had simply offered water, then grain, then a gentle hand, until the terror subsided into a wary trust, which over years had cured into an unbreakable, unspoken bond. They moved together as one organism, whether pushing cattle through a draw or simply standing on a ridge, watching the bruised twilight bleed across the horizon. The order of things was as predictable as the seasons, until it wasn't. It began as a subtle disruption, a slight hitch in Thunder's gait that only a man who knew the horse's every breath could detect. Then came the swelling. On the inside of the left hind leg, just above the hock and beside the old silvered scar, a lump had begun to form. At first, Tobias dismissed it as a kick from a steer or a reaction to a snake bite, though there was no puncture. He applied poultices, hot compresses, liniments that filled the barn with the sharp scent of wintergreen and camphor. The lump remained, indifferent to his efforts. It was not hot to the touch, not tender. It felt dense, solid, an alien intrusion in the familiar landscape of the horse's body. Days bled into weeks, and the lump grew, not with the angry speed of an abscess, but with a slow, deliberate persistence. It became a silent, unsettling presence, a question mark branded onto the flesh of his most trusted companion. It was wrong. Everything in his 60 years of life, from battlefield triage to calving season, had taught him the feel of living tissue, the give of muscle, the fluid pliancy of a cyst. This was none of those. When he pressed his calloused fingers against it, there was no give at all. It was hard, unnervingly so, with strange, planar surfaces beneath the skin, as if a collection of stones had been fused inside the muscle. He'd lie awake in his narrow bed, the wind whistling through the eaves of the cabin, and the image of that unnatural growth would loom in the darkness. It was a disruption to the fundamental grammar of his world, a world built on the logic of dirt, bone, and weather. This lump obeyed no natural law he knew, and the pragmatic confusion that had started as a flicker of concern was now a steady, cold burn of dread in his gut. He could no longer deny it. This was beyond the wisdom of the ranch. This required a different kind of knowledge, a different set of hands. The decision settled upon him with the weight of a winter snow. He had to take Thunder to the vet. The journey to town was a penance. Loading Thunder onto the rattling gooseneck trailer was an exercise in strained trust. The stallion, who would follow Tobias into a blizzard without question, balked at the dark, echoing maw of the trailer. He could sense the wrongness, the deviation from the rhythm of their lives. His eyes, usually so calm and steady, were wide with white-rimmed anxiety. Tobias spoke to him in low, soothing tones, the words themselves less important than the familiar cadence of his voice. "Easy now, big fella. Just a ride. We'll get this sorted." The words felt hollow even to him, sordid, as if it were a tangled rope instead of a piece of his own life that had come inexplicably undone. The drive was 2 hours of graded dirt road and cracked asphalt that jarred his teeth and amplified his anxiety. He watched the horse in his rearview mirror, a stoic silhouette shifting with every bump, and a feeling of profound guilt washed over him. He was the horse's guardian. He was responsible. And he was failing. The landscape, usually a source of harsh comfort, felt alien and menacing. The familiar mesas and buttes seemed to lean in, their stony faces impassive and judgmental. He was leaving his kingdom, a place where he was competent and in control, and heading toward a place of sterile floors and sharp, gleaming instruments, where his decades of experience meant nothing. He was just another worried owner, helpless and afraid. Dr. Samuel Whitmore's clinic was a low brick building on the edge of the small town, smelling of antiseptic, fear, and the faint, sweet odor of hay. Whitmore was a man much like Tobias, practical and weathered, his face a roadmap of long days and difficult nights. His hands, though clean, were thick and capable, hands that knew the architecture of animals from the inside out. He greeted Tobias with a nod, his eyes already on the horse as it was led into the examination bay. "Tobias, been a while. What's the trouble?" His voice was calm, a professional balm designed to soothe frayed nerves, but his gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "It's his leg, Sam. Back left." Tobias ran a hand over Thunder's neck, the gesture as much for his own comfort as the horse's. "There's a growth. Been there a few weeks, getting bigger." Whitmore's examination was a study in methodical precision. He ran his hands over the stallion's body, checking for fever, for signs of systemic illness. Thunder stood stock still, a testament to the trust he placed in the man beside him. Then Whitmore's hands found the lump. He pressed gently at first, his brow furrowing. He pressed harder, his fingers probing, mapping the shape and density of the mass. The professional calm in his face began to dissolve, replaced by the same pragmatic confusion that had haunted Tobias for weeks. He let out a low whistle. "Well, that's not right." He looked from the leg to Tobias, his eyes asking a question. "You said no injury?" "None that I saw. He's not lame on it, not really. Just a hitch now and then. Doesn't seem to be painful. It's not an abscess, that's for sure. No heat, no pitting edema," Whitmore murmured, more to himself than to Tobias. "Feels crystalline." He moved his fingers slowly over the surface. "It's lobulated, like a cluster of something, hard as a rock." He walked over to a stainless steel cart and pulled on a pair of latex gloves. "Let's get a look with the ultrasound." The hum of the machine filled the sterile room, a low thrum of technological intrusion. Whitmore squeezed a cold gel onto the horse's leg, and Thunder flinched, his skin quivering. Tobias held his head, murmuring reassurances. On the grayscale monitor, a shadowy, chaotic image appeared. Whitmore adjusted the probe, his face inches from the screen. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Tobias watched the vet's expression shift from clinical curiosity to outright disbelief. "What is it?" Tobias finally asked, his voice tight. Whitmore didn't answer immediately. He was frozen, staring at the screen. He tapped a finger against the monitor. "See that? The acoustic shadowing? That means the ultrasound waves can't penetrate it. It's too dense. Bone spurs can do that. Calcified hematomas, certain types of tumors, but not like this." He angled the probe again. "The shapes. They're too regular, too defined." He turned to look at Tobias, and for the first time Tobias saw a flicker of something other than medical concern in the vet's eyes. It looked like unease. "This isn't a tumor, Tobias. I mean, it might be, but I've never seen a sarcoma or an osteoma present like this. The edges are sharp, almost geometric." He shut off the machine, the sudden silence deafening. He peeled off his gloves with a snap. "I need to take an X-ray. I need to see what the hell I'm looking at." The 10 minutes it took to process the radiograph felt like a lifetime. Tobias stood with Thunder, his hand resting on the horse's powerful shoulder, the steady rise and fall of his breathing a fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The vet's unease had infected him, confirming his deepest fears that this was something outside the natural order. This wasn't sickness, this was something else. Whitmore returned, holding a large, dark film up to the light board on the wall. He stared at it for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and strained. Jesus Christ. Tobias stepped closer. On the X-ray, against the ghostly gray of muscle and the solid white of bone, was a cluster of impossibly distinct angular shapes. They were not the cloudy, chaotic masses of a cancerous growth. They were geometric, multifaceted, like a handful of gravel had been somehow embedded deep within the horse's leg. They were sharp-edged and dense, utterly alien. "What are they?" Tobias whispered. Whitmore turned from the X-ray, his face pale. The pragmatic veterinarian was gone, replaced by a man staring at an impossibility. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're foreign bodies, a lot of them, densely packed. They're not bullets, not shrapnel. The material is... I don't know. But Tobias," he paused, his eyes locking onto Tobias's, "this wasn't an accident. Look at the scar tissue here on the X-ray. It's old, very old. And see this line? It's a clean margin. This was surgery. A long time ago, someone cut this horse open, put these things inside him, and sewed him back up." The words hung in the sterile air, monstrous and unbelievable. A medical problem had just morphed into something far more sinister. A growth had become a cache. An ailment had become a secret. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. This wasn't an illness to be cured. It was a mystery to be unearthed. And the realization dawned on both men at the same time. They were about to perform surgery on a living treasure chest. And they had no idea who held the key, or if they were coming back for it. The decision to proceed was made in a low, tense conference between the two men, the horse standing patiently between them, oblivious to the strange and dangerous nature of the burden he carried. The growth was putting pressure on the surrounding tendons and vasculature. Leaving it was not an option, but the implications of removing it were terrifying. "If we take this out," Whitmore said, his voice flat, "what we find might be worth a lot of money. And people who hide things of value inside a horse aren't the sort to just forget about it." "He was a stray when I found him," Tobias countered, his mind racing back a decade. "Half-starved, caught in a fence. Whoever did this lost him a long time ago." "Or they've been looking for him a long time," Whitmore shot back. "A horse like this? A big handsome bay stallion? He's not exactly forgettable. We do this, Tobias. We're stepping into something. You understand that, right?" Tobias looked at Thunder. He saw not a vessel for some unknown fortune, but the companion who had stood with him through lonely winters and scorching summers. He saw the creature that had steadied his soul when the memories of war threatened to pull him under. The choice was already made. "He can't go on like this. Take it out, Sam." The preparation for surgery was a grim ballet. Thunder was sedated, his great body sinking slowly and gracefully onto a padded mat, his breathing growing deep and rhythmic. A tourniquet was applied high on his leg, and the area around the lump was shaved and scrubbed with antiseptic iodine, staining the skin a lurid orange. The room was cold. The only sounds the hum of the ventilation and the soft clink of surgical instruments being laid out on a sterile tray. Tobias stood by the horse's head, stroking his velvet nose, his own heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a grave robber. Whitmore, now clad in surgical scrubs and a mask, approached with a scalpel. He paused, the blade hovering over the taut skin. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes meeting Tobias's over the mask. Tobias gave a tight nod. The incision was the point of no return. The scalpel sliced cleanly through the skin. Blood welled up, immediately sponged away by a sterile gauze pad in Whitmore's other hand. He cut deeper, through layers of fascia and connective tissue, his movements precise and economical. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a third presence. Tobias held his breath. Instead of the grisly, misshapen tissue of a tumor or the viscous fluid of an abscess, the vet's scalpel met a strange, yielding resistance. "It's a capsule," Whitmore murmured, probing with a forceps. Thick, fibrous tissue. The body walled it off completely. He worked carefully around the edges, snipping and separating the tough, leathery sac from the surrounding muscle. It was a slow, painstaking process. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, with a last careful cut, the encapsulated mass was free. It was a grotesque, oblong bundle of scar tissue, heavy and solid in the vet's gloved hands. He placed it carefully into a stainless steel basin with a solid clatter. The sound echoed in the quiet room, a sound of finality. The horse was free of it, but the mystery had just been placed on the table. Whitmore took a fresh scalpel. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "Let's see what we've got." He made a careful incision into the fibrous capsule. It was tough, like old leather. He had to apply more pressure than he expected. With a final push, the scalpel tip broke through. There was no pop of fluid, no eruption of diseased cells. Instead, with a soft slitting sound, the capsule split open, and from within, something spilled out into the steel basin with a cascade of impossible color. Neither man spoke. They could only stare, frozen in stunned disbelief. It was not gravel or shrapnel. It was not bone or calcified stone. Lying in the basin, nestled in a bed of what looked like dark, oiled leather bundles, were gemstones. Dozens of them. Perfectly cut, flawlessly clear, catching the sterile light of the operating room and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. There were diamonds, huge and brilliant, that glittered with a cold, pure fire. Deep blue sapphires the color of a midnight sky, emeralds of a green so vivid it hurt the eyes, and rubies the shade of arterial blood. They were magnificent, terrifying, and utterly, completely impossible. They spilled from small, meticulously stitched pouches of oiled leather designed to protect them from the internal environment of the horse. This wasn't a random collection. This was a fortune, a king's ransom, lying in a bloody basin in a vet clinic in the middle of nowhere. The air left Tobias's lungs in a rush. The world tilted on its axis. The solid ground of his reality, the world of dust, cattle, and routine, had just crumbled away, revealing a chasm of unbelievable wealth and terrifying danger. This was not the work of common rustlers. The precision of the original surgery, the quality of the gems, the careful packaging. This was sophisticated, deliberate, and ruthless. This was the work of someone who would not hesitate to kill to protect their assets. And those assets had been walking around his ranch for a decade. Whitmore slowly, reverently, picked up one of the diamonds with a forceps. It was the size of a robin's egg, its facets catching the light with a blinding intensity. "My God, Tobias," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" Tobias couldn't answer. He was staring at the scar on Thunder's leg, then back at the glittering hoard in the basin. The horse wasn't just a horse. He was a vessel, a living, breathing vault, a secret that had just been violently exposed. And the question that had been a faint whisper was now a screaming terror in his mind. Who did this? And are they coming back for it? The silence of his ranch no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm, the quiet before the hunters arrived to reclaim their treasure. And he and his horse were standing right in the middle of the killing ground. The days that followed were steeped in a low-grade, constant paranoia. Tobias took the gemstones home in a canvas satchel, the weight of them in the passenger seat of his truck, a constant, terrifying reminder of the new reality he inhabited. He hid them in an old ammunition box buried beneath the floorboards of his tack room. But the knowledge of their presence was a poison that seeped into every corner of his life. Every dust cloud on the horizon was an approaching vehicle. Every creak of the cabin at night was a footstep outside. His solitude, once a comfort, was now a vulnerability. He was one man on a vast, open landscape, guarding a secret that could get him killed. His relationship with Thunder changed. The easy, unspoken companionship was now tinged with a terrible irony. He would groom the stallion, his brush moving over the powerful muscles, and be acutely aware of the hollow space that now lay beneath the skin of his leg. The new scar, clean and stitched, was a brand of their shared secret. He would look into the horse's calm, dark eyes and wonder what he had seen, what terrors he had endured at the hands of the people who had used his body as a safe. The horse was no longer just his companion. He was a living piece of evidence, a liability, a walking, breathing fortune that tied Tobias to a violent, unknown past. He found himself watching the road, scanning the horizon, a knot of fear perpetually tight in his stomach. The money, the impossible, life-altering wealth buried in his floorboards, brought him no comfort, only a profound and suffocating dread. It was a treasure he could never spend, a secret he could never share. Whitmore had been sworn to silence, a promise Tobias trusted. The vet, practical as ever, had put it bluntly before he left the clinic. "Bury them, Tobias. Bury them and forget you ever saw them. Tell no one. That kind of money doesn't have a history. It has a body count." Forgetting, however, was impossible. The gems were a gravitational force, pulling his thoughts into their orbit, warping the simple fabric of his days. He imagined a different life, a life without debt, without the constant grind of ranch work, a life of ease. The temptation was a vile, seductive whisper in the back of his mind, but it was always silenced by the image of Thunder, half-starved and tangled in a fence, his eyes wild with a terror that now, finally, had a context. He hadn't just been lost, he'd been running. 2 weeks after the surgery, on a blistering afternoon when the heat shimmered off the land in waves, a car appeared on the long dirt road leading to the ranch. It wasn't a truck, not a local's vehicle. It was an old, dusty sedan, moving with a slowness that spoke of age and caution. Tobias's heart seized in his chest. He grabbed the old rifle he kept by the door, his hands slick with sweat. He stood in the shadows of the porch, watching the car crawl closer, his mind a maelstrom of fear and calculation. This is it. They've found him. The car pulled to a stop in the yard, the engine sputtering into silence. The dust settled. The driver's side door opened with a geriatric groan, and a man emerged. He was not what Tobias had expected. There was no menace, no swagger of a hardened criminal. He was old, frail, his body stooped and thin inside a worn suit jacket that was too warm for the weather. His hair was a wisp of white, and his face was a constellation of wrinkles and age spots. He leaned heavily on the car door for a moment, as if gathering the strength to stand, before he straightened up and looked toward the cabin. His eyes, watery and pale blue, held not a threat, but a profound and searching weariness. He looked like a man who had been traveling for a very, very long time. Tobias remained in the shadows, the rifle held loosely at his side. The old man took a few hesitant steps forward, his gaze sweeping over the corral, where Thunder stood swishing his tail in the shade of a cottonwood. The man's breath caught in a soft, audible gasp. His eyes fixed on the stallion, and his entire frail frame seemed to tremble. He paid no attention to Tobias. He had eyes only for the horse. He raised a shaky hand and pointed. "Treasure?" he whispered, the name lost in the vast, quiet air, a question directed at the universe itself. Tobias stepped out from the porch, the rifle still in his hand, though it now felt absurd and theatrical. "That's not his name," he said, his voice hard. The old man startled, turning to face him. He seemed to see Tobias for the first time. There was no fear in his eyes, only a desperate, pleading hope. "The scar," the old man said, his voice raspy with emotion. "On his left hind leg. Does he have a scar?" "He has one," Tobias said, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. Tears welled in the old man's eyes, spilling down the deep ravines of his cheeks. He took a staggering step forward, his hands outstretched as if in prayer. "My God," he wept, a raw, broken sound. "After all these years. I found him." He introduced himself as Ezra Caldwell. Over the next hour, sitting on the porch with a glass of water that trembled in his hand, he unspooled a story that dismantled Tobias's world for the second time. It was a story of love, art, and the desperation of war. His wife, Elizabeth, had not been a jeweler. She was a master gem cutter, an artist whose medium was light and stone. She didn't create for commerce, but for beauty, each gem a self-contained sculpture, the culmination of her life's work. She said they were captured light, Ezra recounted, his voice thick with memory. Each one held a moment, the green of the forest after a rain, the blue of a winter twilight, the fire of a dying sun. They had lived a quiet life in a country that had been torn apart by civil war decades ago, a place Tobias only knew from grainy newsreels. When the conflict reached their city, chaos erupted. Looters and soldiers, indistinguishable from one another, roamed the streets. There was no time to escape with their belongings. But Elizabeth could not bear to leave her life's work behind, to have it stolen and melted down, its artistry destroyed. She said it would be like burning a library, Ezra said, his gaze distant. So we came up with a plan, a terrible, desperate plan. Their horse, a magnificent young stallion named Treasure, was their only valuable possession that could move. With the help of a trusted veterinarian, a friend sworn to secrecy, they performed the surgery themselves on their kitchen table. They sedated Treasure, and Elizabeth, with the same steady hands she used to facet a diamond, helped place her life's work, her entire artistic legacy, inside the animal she loved. Each collection of stones was wrapped in oiled leather pouches she had stitched herself. It was the only way, Ezra whispered, his eyes closed as if reliving the horror. Our only chance to save her soul's work. Their plan was to flee to the coast and take a ship to America. But in the chaos of their escape, they were separated. A mortar shell exploded near the stables where Ezra was readying the horse. In the ensuing panic and fire, Treasure, terrified, broke free and bolted into the war-torn countryside. Ezra was injured, captured by one of the roving militias. He spent 2 years as a prisoner. By the time he was released, the war was over, his wife was gone, dead from the influenza that had swept through the refugee camps, and the horse had vanished. All he had left was a single impossible promise he had made to Elizabeth the night before she died. Find our horse, bring my light home. For 35 years, Ezra Caldwell's life had been a singular, relentless quest. He had worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and followed every rumor, every whisper of a handsome bay stallion with a strange scar. The search had taken him across his own ravaged country and then to America, where he'd heard many of the stolen horses had been shipped and sold. It had consumed his youth, his health, and his money. He was a ghost, haunted by a promise. A photograph he showed Tobias, faded and creased, showed a younger Ezra with a vibrant, smiling woman, her arm around the neck of a young, unscarred bay stallion. It was undeniably Thunder. As Ezra's story concluded, the setting sun cast a long shadow across the porch. The world had gone silent. The rifle Tobias had been holding now felt like a lead weight. The gems buried beneath his floorboards were no longer a source of fear or temptation. They had been transformed. They were not a criminal's hoard. They were a woman's soul. They were a husband's love. They were the physical manifestation of a promise that had survived war, time, and unimaginable loss. Tobias looked at the frail, broken man before him, a man who had given his entire life to this quest, and then he looked out at the horse, standing peacefully in the corral. He was now at the heart of a moral reckoning that was heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He could keep the fortune, a treasure beyond his wildest dreams, and no one would ever know. It would be his secret, his comfort, his golden parachute from a life of hardship. Or he could return it to this ghost of a man, fulfilling a sacred vow made between a husband and his dying wife, and be left with nothing but the dust and the silence he had always known. The weight of the choice was crushing, a physical pressure in his chest. His life of solitude and simple truths had prepared him for hardship, but not for this. Not for the moment he would have to decide the true nature of Treasure. The climax arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet, heartbreaking gravity. Tobias stood up, his joints creaking. He looked at Ezra, whose hopeful, tear-filled eyes were fixed on him, and then he looked toward the corral. "Let's see," Tobias said, his voice rough. It was the only thing he could think to say. He walked down the porch steps and across the dusty yard to the corral gate, his boots scuffing softly. Ezra followed, his steps shuffling, uncertain. Tobias unlatched the gate and swung it open, then stepped back. Thunder, who had been watching them with intelligent curiosity, lifted his head. Ezra took a hesitant step into the corral. He raised a trembling hand. "Treasure!" he called out, his voice cracking with a lifetime of pent-up grief and hope. "It's me, boy. It's Ezra." The stallion's ears flickered. He looked at the old man, his head tilted. There was a flicker of something in his dark eyes. Not recognition, perhaps, but a deep, primal curiosity at the sound of this new voice, this old name. He took a step toward Ezra, his nostrils flaring as he drank in the scent of the stranger. Ezra began to weep openly now, great silent sobs shaking his frail body. "You remember," he choked out. "You remember me." Tobias stood by the open gate, his heart a stone in his chest. He felt like an intruder in his own home. This was their moment, the reunion that this old man had sacrificed his life for. He watched the horse nuzzle Ezra's outstretched hand, and a profound sense of loss washed over him. He was about to lose the one constant in his lonely world. The choice was clear. The gems belonged to Ezra. The horse belonged to Ezra. His decade of companionship was just an interlude, a footnote in a much grander, more tragic story. He had only been a caretaker, a guardian for a story that was not his own. "His name is Thunder now," Tobias said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through Ezra's emotional reverie. Ezra turned, his face a mess of tears and confusion. "He's lived here for 10 years, Tobias continued, stepping forward. "This is his home." A new tension entered the air, the quiet grief of reunion replaced by the sharp edge of conflict. "He is my horse," Ezra said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I raised him from a colt. My wife, Elizabeth. She loved him. And I found him starving and saved his life," Tobias countered, his own emotions finally surfacing, a raw mix of defensiveness and sorrow. "I cared for him. He doesn't know you." It was a stalemate born of love and loss, two men, from two different worlds, both laying a legitimate claim to the heart of the animal that stood between them. The setting sun painted the scene in hues of gold and blood orange, a dramatic backdrop for the quiet drama. The real treasure was not the stones buried in the ground. It was the loyalty of the magnificent creature standing before them. And in that moment, a silent understanding passed between the two men. They could argue, they could fight. They could even go to the law, though that would expose a secret that would endanger them all. Or they could let the one being whose life was at the center of it all make the final decision. Tobias looked at Ezra, a challenge and a concession in his eyes. "Let him choose," he said. Ezra nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. He understood. This was the only way. It was the purest test. Ezra walked to one end of the large corral, near the water trough. Tobias walked to the other, by the open gate that led back to the familiar path to the stables. They stood about 50 feet apart, two poles in a silent drama. In the center, Thunder stood, his coat gleaming in the fading light. He looked from one man to the other, his ears swiveled, listening. His dark eyes were thoughtful, weighing the figures at the edges of his world. One was a memory, a scent from a distant past, a voice that echoed in some primal part of his brain. The other was the present. He was the hand that fed him, the voice that soothed him, the man whose presence meant safety, routine, and home. Ezra held out his hand. "Come on, treasure," he pleaded softly. "Come home, boy." Tobias said nothing. He simply stood, his hands at his sides, his heart exposed. He put every ounce of his 10 years of quiet companionship, every shared sunrise, every winter storm, every silent conversation on a high ridge, into his gaze. He offered no command, no inducement. He just was, present, open, waiting. The horse stood for a long, agonizing moment, the fulcrum of two lives. He looked at Ezra, the ghost from his youth. He took a single step in his direction, and Ezra's face lit up with a fragile, beautiful hope. But then the horse stopped. He turned his great head and looked toward Tobias. He looked at the open gate, at the familiar barn beyond, at the man who was the anchor of his entire known world. He stood for another heartbeat, the decision seeming to ripple through his powerful body. Then with a calm, deliberate slowness, he turned away from Ezra and began to walk. He walked not with the panicked flight of his youth, but with the steady, certain gait of an animal who knows where he belongs. He walked straight to Tobias McCoy. He stopped directly in front of him and nudged his head gently against the rancher's chest, a simple, profound gesture of allegiance. Home is not where you came from. Home is a choice. Tears streamed down Tobias's face, hot and cleansing. He wrapped his arms around the stallion's thick neck, burying his face in his mane, inhaling the familiar scent of horse and dust and sun. He had won. But it felt less like a victory and more like a grace he had been given, a confirmation that the quiet, simple life he had built had a value that transcended any fortune. When he finally looked up, he saw Ezra standing by the trough, his shoulders slumped not in anger, but in a kind of peaceful, heartbreaking acceptance. The old man had not lost his horse. He had simply learned where his horse's home was, and in doing so, he had finally found the end of his long and weary road. That night, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to crackle in the cold desert air, Tobias dug up the ammunition box. He wiped the dirt from its metal surface and carried it to the porch where Ezra sat, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the immense darkness. Tobias set the box on the small table between them and unlatched the lid. He didn't have to say a word. He opened the small, oiled leather pouches one by one and poured their contents onto the rough wooden surface. The gemstones glittered in the dim light of the porch lamp, a river of captured starlight, a testament to a woman's artistic soul. Ezra stared at them, his breath catching. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up a single deep green emerald. He held it up to the light, turning it over and over. "Elizabeth's," he whispered, his voice full of a reverence that bordered on pain. She called this one first leaf, the color of the first leaf on the oak tree outside our window in spring. He looked at Tobias, his eyes swimming with a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "She would have liked you," he said simply. "A man who understands that a living creature is worth more than a stone, no matter how beautiful." Tobias gave the gemstones to Ezra. It was not a transaction. There was no talk of reward or payment. It was a transfer of stewardship, the closing of a circle. He was returning a woman's legacy to the man who had given his life to protect it. Ezra stayed for 2 more days. He spent his time not trying to win the horse's affection, but simply being in his presence, telling stories of Elizabeth and of Treasure's colthood to Tobias, who listened, absorbing the history that was now woven into the fabric of his own life. The horse, Thunder, would often stand near them, a silent participant, as if he too were listening to the story of his own past. On the 3rd day, Ezra left. He carefully packed the gemstones into the old box. He and Tobias stood in the yard beside the dusty sedan. "What will you do now?" Tobias asked. "I'll build a place for them," Ezra said, a new light in his tired eyes. "A small museum, perhaps, in her name, so people can see her work, so her light isn't hidden in the darkness anymore." He had a purpose again, not one of searching, but of building. He was no longer a ghost. He was a curator of a legacy. He offered Tobias his hand. "Thank you," he said, the 2 words carrying the weight of a lifetime. "For everything. For being his home." Tobias watched the old car drive away, a plume of dust in its wake, until it was just a speck on the horizon, and then nothing at all. He turned and walked back toward the corral. Thunder met him at the fence, nuzzling his shoulder. Tobias ran his hand down the horse's leg, his fingers tracing the faint new line of the scar. It was no longer a mark of mystery or fear. It was a testament, a story, a map of a journey that had crossed wars and decades to find its end right here, in this quiet corner of the world. He was left with what he had before, the dust, the silence, the endless sky. But everything was different. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the richness of a story he now carried. His solitude was not loneliness. It was a guardianship. He had been tested, faced with a choice between a life of ease and a life of integrity, and he had chosen the latter. He had been given the chance to measure the value of his own soul, and had not been found wanting. The ranch was no longer just a sanctuary from the world. It was his place in it, a purpose hard-earned and deeply felt. He swung himself up onto Thunder's bare back, the familiar movement as natural as breathing. Together they rode out toward the high ridge as the first light of dawn began to break, man and horse moving as one. He was not a rich man, not in the way the world measured wealth. But as he looked out over the vast, silent land that was his, with the steady, living heart of a legend beneath him, Tobias McCoy knew a profound and quiet peace. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, the keeper of a promise, the guardian of a treasure far more precious than gems.